Do you dream of writing a novel? When you feel the urgency to write a novel, you aren't making it up. When that urgency won't let go, there's a reason. Turn your readers into raving fans. Reveal the power of your voice and your story. Writing is an act of courage, and you have what it takes. How to Write a Novel That Sells by Lana McAra will take you across the finish line. Visit howtowriteanovelthatsells.net and take that powerful next step now.
Welcome to the Fiction Writers Podcast with Lana McAra, where you will discover tips, tricks, and ideas for fiction that is #unputdownable. Here you'll find new energy, new perspectives, new resources, and new ideas that will spark your creativity into a blaze of brilliance. It's easier than you think. Be sure you visit our website at www.fictionwriterspodcast.com. While you're there, subscribe to us via your favorite network. Now, get out your notebook, tune in, and let's get started.
Are you working on your first book and wondering if you will ever get that thing done? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. My name is Lana McAra, and welcome to the Fiction Writers Podcast. Tips, tricks, and ideas for fiction that is #unputdownable. Today, I'm delighted to welcome to the broadcast R.A. Davis. Ron is a polymath, which is a pretentious way of saying they know a little bit about a lot of different stuff. Programmer, photographer, paramedic, podcaster, and mentor. A lifelong fan of science fiction, 2020 was the year to finally finish a novel born out of a pinup photo shoot a decade ago. I've got to hear that story. The Adventures of Space Girl Red was a debut novel, and book 2 in the Space Girl Adventure series is Adventures of Space Girl Green, which was released in 2024. And the prequel novel, Capricorn Rising, came out in February of this year. Welcome, Ron.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm excited because you've got a little different take on this process of getting that first book done. So what advice would you give to someone who's caught in the throes? So many pages and not sure what to do.
Yeah, there are a number of different sort of aspects of getting it done. I will say that both of my novels were started during NaNoWriMo, so National Novel Writing Month in January, or not January, it's in November. Both of them, actually all three of them were nano novels. And the one great thing about National Novel Writing Month, and if your listeners don't know what that is, it is for the month of November, you're supposed to write a novel, and they define a novel as 50,000 words, which is 1,666 words a day. I think that's right. Yeah, a day to write. And one of the things that does, and I think this is very key to finishing a novel, is it just makes you write. One of my favorite authors of all time is Robert Heinlein, and he had 3 rules of writing. Don't always agree with the third one, which is don't rewrite. But the first one was writers write. That's what makes the difference between a writer and a non-writer, is that they write. And I find for me and for a lot of other writers that you can't write and edit at the same time. You've got to be able to turn that editor off and then just put words on the page. Just write, tell yourself whatever you have to say. I remember one of my mantras on one of my books was, I just have to write 50,000 words of crap. It doesn't have to be good. It just has to be down. And then you can go back and rewrite. So I think that's key, is to turn off your critic and just write the book. When you're writing your first novel, 50,000 words sounds like a lot. 100,000 words sounds like a lot. When you're writing your third novel, you'll throw that stuff away. For Capricorn Rising, it was actually a much longer, bigger story. And I cut 15,000 words out of that book almost immediately because the story was just too wide and it needed to focus down on something. And I was just listening to an interview with Brandon Sanderson, who, to be fair, writes like 300,000 and 400,000 word novels. But he says one thing that he really sees as a big difference between an amateur and a pro is a pro will throw away a chapter. You just got to get past the idea that every one of your words is precious and just focus on writing something. You can always fix it later.
Oh, yeah, that's such good advice. All of it, because writing from the beginning of the novel and plowing through to the end, that's the only way to really make good progress. Otherwise, you get in a spin and you end up in quicksand and you'll never get out.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very easy to write your first chapters 1,000 times and never finish the book, which is another thing. You've got to keep that forward movement, that forward momentum, so that, and that means not going back and fixing something. I mean, I'll be writing and realize the first chapter's got to be rewritten, but that doesn't mean I go back and rewrite the first chapter. I just keep going forward on that. And I'm a discovery writer, and that means that, I don't know what's going to happen. When I was writing the draft I'm working on now for the next one in the series, Orange, I got to the center and the story took a huge turn I didn't even know was coming. And one of the things that was kind of cool about that was I wrote the first half of the book thinking something was true, just like my main character. And then at this turning point, it wasn't true. And we were both surprised. So I hope the reader would be the same way.
That's when you know you're really on to something, when the story starts talking to you.
Yeah. When you say it, and she reached around in the back of it, and what? She discovered this thing, and you're like, oh, wow, she did that, did she? That's a surprise. Yeah.
Yeah. One time I was typing away at the dining room table. I had my laptop on the dining room table. This was years ago, and my kids were still at home. They're all grown now. And I was just flying because I had a deadline. I was trying to pound it out before dinner, all that stuff was going on. And I was laughing and typing, and my son walked by, his teenager walked by, and he said, what are you writing? I said, you wouldn't believe what this guy just said. And he got this look on his face, and he said, you are scary.
It is weird. We are a strange lot, we writers.
Exactly. So you get to the middle of the story, and all of a sudden there's a big shift.
Right. The whole story really changed. And that's what you want. The turn. Well, first of all, the middle of the story, you should have a turn, but it was just so obvious when it happened that this was way better. It did cause problems, and I've been working on it ever since, trying to reconfigure the entire story. But there's no two ways about that difference being that turning point being an excellent thing to have in your novel.
When you get into flow, it seems like things just get done. They just happen, and it's so much better than getting into the head game of trying to figure it out.
Yeah, the other thing is I was talking, I have a book coach, and I was talking to him about the fact that I said, oh, Space Girl Green was a throwaway line in Space Girl Red. She just said something, and it was just sort of this throwaway thing, and then that ends up being the theme of Green's novel, and you don't realize you've done that. And I've done that for multiple situations. I know multiple times in the books where you have a throwaway comment in there somewhere, and you're like, there's a whole story behind that comment.
Absolutely. Going back, and I've been writing for almost 30 years, so going back to previous work and reading it again after, say, 10 years of not looking at it, it's almost like somebody else wrote it, because you moved on now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what comes after the first draft?
Oh, I said I'm a discovery writer, a pantser. I still like pantser. I know some people don't like pantser. I don't know why, but I like pantser because it does feel like I'm writing for the seat of my pants. Is that I almost always I'm reverse outlining, and that's something in the revision process. You've got to get sort of a picture of the overall novel, and so you get that picture, and then you go back and you make the plot work. I kind of do multiple revisions. So I go back and I make sure all the scenes that are needed to be there with all the things that happen in the right order are there. That's sort of my plot version. And then there's a go back through it sort of continuity. because now I've made a whole bunch of changes and maybe I broke something. And one thing I added in green that I didn't have in red was what I call my deep syntax edit, which is in green, I did it backwards. So what I did was I had this version of the novel pretty close, pretty good. And I started editing it backwards from the last chapter to the first. And I was looking at the sentences. So it's down at the sentence level, the paragraph level, the chapter level. And when you read it backwards, every chapter stands on its own. Because like I'm actually editing the chapter forward, but I'm going backwards in the chapter. So each one of those is on its own, and that makes it much easier to look at it at a lower level and go and fix sentences to make them stronger. That was, when you're a writer, and maybe we'll talk a little bit more about this, but when you're a writer, you go on this sort of journey of you get better at something, which each one. And so for green, the thing I got better at was sentences. And so there's that aspect. I think for Capricorn Rising, which was the third book I wrote, well, actually I wrote it second and then edited it into the third, but it was much more about getting the emotion into the scene. So making your reader feel. I think with red, I always say that red is James Bond. And there's not necessarily a lot of feeling in James Bond, right? Like as long as they come in and they kick butt and they get, and the bad guys defeated in the end, that's a James Bond movie. Later versions of James Bond, they've actually put a lot more emotion into it. But then with green and with Capricorn Rising, which was a prequel telling all these characters' stories when they were children, I tried to make every scene make the reader feel something. When you're looking at that scene, like what do I want them to feel here, not what do I want them to know. So that was sort of one of the progressions, and the other was the sentence level.
Yes, writing a novel is like having 6 plates spinning at the same time. And it's easy for one to just spin off, but as we practice, we get more and more accustomed to keeping them all going. And that's what mature writing is, isn't it? We just learn here and learn there. I think writing is one of the skills. I know there's quite a few, but one of the skills that you have to learn by doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That is true. And actually, I have a question for you. You've written so many books. I've been starting to hear people talk about their writing career and their ability to write. And I heard an interview of George R. R. Martin of Stephen King, and he said, Martin asked him, how do you write so many books? And he says, well, I write every day, and he writes 7 days a week, 2,000 words a day. And he said, and I write pretty clean. So, and I was like, you write pretty clean? And then I was in a writing group, and one of the people said, I write pretty clean, so my editor doesn't have to do much. And I was like, okay. And then I asked her, I said, when did that happen? And she said, it happened after my 6th novel. And then I was listening to Sanderson teach, and he's like, you need to write 6 novels and throw them away. Because that 6th novel will be the novel where you actually get good. And I've heard that number come up multiple times. When you were, in your experiences, your writing journey, when did you start feeling like the stuff that you're writing almost in your first draft was pretty clean, to use the term?
That's a really good question. I wrote 14 years without getting published. So during the 14 years, I took 2 different writers' courses. I was reading voraciously, writing books and studying authors that I loved to see what they were doing. How did they open their book? How do they close it? How do they develop their characters and all this? So I was really educating myself. And when I figured out what I had done, 14 years is the same number of years as a medical doctor. So I have to say, my first book got published. It was pretty clean, and I have been writing pretty clean ever since. But that's, because I put in so much time previously. I was an English minor, education major. I was an English teacher. I taught English in high school English one year. So, the grammar and all that was just like second nature to me. But what really helped me was a book called Make Your Words Work by Gary Provost. And that was about omitting needless words. And I know that Strunk and White, The Elements of Style, says omit needless words. But it wasn't until I read Gary Provost that I realized the power that comes from tight writing. And that didn't happen to me until sometime later. I can't really say. Book number 6, around book number 6, I won the Christie Award. So at that point, my writing kicked off. But one of the key elements was a really terrific substantive editor. She was recommended to me by someone, another author. I didn't even know what an editor did at that stage of the game. And she came in, and the red marks on my manuscript was unbelievable. Back in those days, we were sending it in the mail, and she was sending me the copy. She had notes on it. And she taught me how to write a direct sentence, where to start the book. She'd put a big arrow. Your book starts here, and it would always be in chapter 3. She said, I don't know why you write chapters 1 and 2. And just forget about them. So I had a good mentor. She was not a writer. She never wrote a book in her life, but she was a terrific editor. So,
yeah, I'm still looking for that editor, and I'm kind of starting to get a feel that what you want is an editor who's not a writer. Because I've had 2 that were writers, and they they want you to write their book, and it's like, I don't write your book, right? Like, I don't write the kind of book you write, or I don't write like you write. And they have to be able to abstract that. I think an editor doesn't have one way. An editor who doesn't write doesn't have like one way it's supposed to be. So there's that aspect. When we talk about 6 books, there's a thing in science fiction. People say, I think it was, gets a trick. You know how these attributions, these first rules are, like, who knows who really said it. Heinlein gets it sometimes. I heard it from Purnell, but they said you need to write 1 million words of craft. And 1 million words, that's a lot of book. That's at least 10 books at 100,000 words a book. That's a lot. That's way more than 6. But I'm listening to the audiobook of Green, the proofs of it, and I realized just how much better Green is than Red. They're like 2 years apart, but how much better writer I am when I got to Green. And so you could just see, like, what will I be like 6 books down, like 3 books more into the future.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, there's that process of it.
I really love the way you think about going forward.
Yeah.
How am I going to improve going forward? That's a beautiful mindset.
And I will say that when I wrote Red, you wanted the story of the pinup photo shoot. So
yeah,
I had, like a lot of readers, I have this idea in my head of this big epic thriller / sci-fi political story that I want to write. And I tried to write that in Nano 1 year, and I wrote 80,000 words on it, and it was nowhere. I now know a lot of where it wasn't. Like, it hadn't even got to the inciting incident after 80,000 words. And it was very much just wandering around. And I was like, okay, I'm not good enough to write this book. So I'm just going to put that aside. And now I need something that I won't hold precious. And I had done this. At the time, I was sort of an amateur photographer. I shot a lot of like models, and I had a lot of cosplayers and different like Renaissance Festival kind of people. And this model showed up one day, and I had been on a trip, and I had bought these ray guns. I actually have the newer version of sitting on my shelf up here. These ray guns at a toy store liquidation, and I had those, and I said, "Hey, let's do something like Space Girl, like retro sci-fi Space Girl, and with these ray guns." And she says, "Well, she had unnaturally red hair, and she said, well, I've got this red outfit." And then I lit it so it was red in the background. And then whenever I was editing those pictures or posting those pictures, she was always Space Girl Red because of that. And I just said, okay, let's turn that into a character and write it. And, if I write 50,000 words and they suck, and I won't care. I'll just throw them away. But then you write 50,000 words, they mostly don't suck. And now you're sucked into this story. And you just keep doing it, So I'm like, I had to justify the entire title. So Space Girl Red. Why was she Space Girl and not Space Woman? And so there's a thing about that in her world, and her world doesn't have men. Boys aren't born on her home planet. And so, and then there's the colors. So now they're all organized into groups of 6 called rainbows, and they each have a color name, which, is one of those things you think, oh, this is a great world building thing until you have all your characters only have 6 names. It's like, wait a minute, I can't have 2 rainbows in the same room at the same time, or you won't be able to understand whose dialogue is whose. So they change their names. Their color names change as they progress in their career. So red becomes pink, and depending on your career, it either becomes pink or darker or lighter, depending on which one yours is. So anyway, it was one of those things. That's how red came along. And then, so I have 6 books. I have the 6 colors because indigo and violet are a lie. And purple's the last one. So.
Wow. So you're saying it's like a space odyssey or fantasy?
Yeah. So again, with the pinup idea, this retro science fiction thing, she has a flying saucer. She carries ray guns. Matter of fact, when I was writing Red, I went and I found all of these pulp sort of trope isms. And then I tried to work them all into the story. And some of them I was reading Red a few months back, and I know one of the characters says, I know you're an ace pilot. I'm like, I know I put ace pilot in there for no other reason than it was on my list. It kind of like, that's like a ace pilot. It's the words don't work together. But I put it in there because I had this list of all those sort of tropes, and most all of them are, there's a Planet X. There's flying monkeys, but that's not really a science fiction trope. But anyway, yeah.
Wow. So how do you write a better sentence?
I got this book. I actually asked my writing group at one point when I was editing Green. I said, hey, do you guys get any books on how to write a sentence? Because there's lots of books on plotting, a lot of books on plotting. And there's quite a few books on character. But I was like, are there books on sentences at that level? Because I remember once reading, I think it's Screenplay, and it was by J. Michael Straczynski, who is the executive producer and writer of Babylon 5. And he was talking about in there how one of the characters in there is very self-centered. And he said, when I write his dialogue, in his sentences, his name is in the middle. He is the center of his sentences. And I'm like, that is writer. It is crafting the sentences to tell you something about the dialogue, the dialogue tell you something about the character. And so I asked that, and someone suggested a list of them. But the one that really got me, I pulled it up here so that I wouldn't forget. It's Writing Tools, 55 Essential Strategies for Every Writer by Roy Peter Clark. And it is a quick read. These 52 or 55 strategies are all very sort of short chapters on one thing. And that gave me all kinds of tools for looking at sentences when I went back to do my rewrite. I'll give your listeners a couple of them, pulling up my notes here. It is sometimes you listen to, you say these and it's like, well, shouldn't that be obvious? But it's definitely not obvious.
Yeah.
Begin with the subject and the verb, and put the subject and the verb together. A lot of times what people will do is they'll say the subject, and then they'll say something about the subject, and maybe something about whatever they just said, and then they'll put the verb on the end of the sentence of what the subject did. And you don't realize how much that just grinds your sentence to a stop, and how much that stops the reader, sends them off in a weird direction. And when they finally get to the verb, they forgot what the beginning of the sentence was. And so though that was one that was very, very much to me, I will look at a sentence. I'm like, why is this sentence weird? Okay, where's the subject? Where's the verb? Oh, they're apart. Let's put them together. And I will say to take that to the next part of this, which is how do you make a better paragraph? People do the same thing. It's like, make your paragraph about one thing with a beginning, a middle, and the end. And don't try to go off somewhere else and come back in the middle of the paragraph, which is what people will do. And people do this when they're talking. kind of like I just did. I'll be talking about paragraphs and I'm like, then people do this. And then you kind of go off, and that happens in the middle of paragraphs. And then by the time you come back, people are like, what was this about again? So that's a big one. Put the subject and the verb together. Vary the length of your sentences. Same is true of paragraphs too, but it's all short and all long. Because a lot of times people are like, oh, I shouldn't write really long sentences. So they try to write everything short. Or they want to write nothing but really big, long sentences. And so you need to have some variability in there and realize that sentence length affects how fast the reader moves through this prose. So if you want something to be slow, then write longer sentences. Slow the reader down. And if you want things to be fast, then write shorter sentences and make things happen like that. And we talk about that. And I don't think that when you're writing, people think about it, because I think that the act of writing doesn't feel like the act of reading, in the sense that, like, you can write a really long sentence and it doesn't feel like it's slow, even though it's a lot of words, because you're thinking about the sentence, and that's not how your reader experiences that sentence. They're like, bam, you know, and there's that idea. That's why I have that read, and reading through the thing, because you start getting the feel for what your pace is on there. So those are just a couple of things I learned. I am old, been on this planet over half a century, and I didn't actually understand what passive voice was. I thought if you wrote in passive voice, you were grammatically incorrect. But that's not true. You can be completely grammatically correct and write in passive voice. But also, the thing about passive voice is it makes the subject seem passive. And you say, well, I don't want my subject to seem passive. Well, maybe you do. Like, maybe you literally want that character to seem passive, like things are happening to them instead of them making things happen. And so write some sentences in passive voice when they're in a situation where where the character is passive. Like, that voice actually tells the reader unconsciously something. And I didn't know that till I read his book. And then I was like, oh, well, she's in situations where she's not doing anything. I'm going to put some passive voice in here. And it'll make people feel something. And, a writer or an editor might look at that and go, you wrote this in passive voice. It's like, yeah, I did that. I did it on. Anyway, those are some things about sentence and paragraph level.
Yeah, it's very good. Very good. I like to think about pacing with the long and short sentences. Like, if you're in an action scene where people are getting, bullets are flying and people are dodging behind cars, they're not talking in long sentences. They're saying, get down over there.
Yeah.
That's fast. But if they're walking in a garden and they're talking about, oh, look at the tree. Isn't it beautiful? It's this, it's that. Those are slow sentences because they're slowly moving through the garden. So that is really good information there about make your sentences match the action that is happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I talked to an author, Wesley Chu, once at a science fiction adventure, and he is a martial artist, and he wrote a book with martial arts in it, which you'd expect. And he said one of the things he learned was the reader doesn't want the level of detail he wants to write. Because yes, if the reader is a martial artist, he might understand what you're saying, but nobody else will. And that's another example of a place we can have where, especially if it's something that we are passionate about, we put way more in there, but now we've slowed everything down and we probably confuse the reader. So there's that aspect of understanding what the words are doing and the paragraphs are doing, the sentences are doing.
Yes. What's appropriate right now? Is it appropriate to go into this long explanation of psychological issues? I mean, if you're sitting in the psychiatrist's office and he's trying to help you with a big problem, that might be okay, but not most of the time. It's just like, you're depressed, dude. You need to get a life.
Yeah, and I was just talking to my coach again about Orange, and we were talking about having a character in the book, because I'm using, in this case, this is something I'm learning. So this is where I am in my learning journey right now, is plotting and using a framework. I've been through a couple of them now, but I have rewritten the plot of Orange using the Save the Cat beats. And one of the things that they talk about in there is they call it the B story. And there's a character that needs to be in there. So that's often, if you like, it's not a romance, you would put the romance in the B story. But the purpose of that character is to allow the main character, because Save the Cat comes out of screenplays a lot more, to allow the main character to have someone to talk to about their problems. Well, those are when your character can explain their problems. And those aren't happening in the middle of an action scene, right? They're happening in a romantic dinner or something. And so there is a place to talk about the detail, but that's almost something that has to be built in to the whole story. Like, give them a place they can do that, and don't do it when they're not there or in that situation.
Yeah, that's what happened to me with my first book. My first book, I had 19 rejections. I knew it was a good story. I couldn't cross the finish line because back then you were only traditionally published or you weren't published at all. So I kept knocking on doors, sending this manuscript through the mail. And I had this like epiphany that the girl, the main character, had no one to talk to. She wasn't talking to her husband because she was scared. She was scared to tell him all the stuff that was happening. And so I put in a stray dog that comes to the porch, and she starts sitting there and talking to the stray dog, trying to make friends with this dog. And that's when I got published. And I think the dog had a lot to do with it.
Yeah. Well, because it has an interesting hook all by itself. She's talking to a dog. It also gives her a place to put that might have just been exposition that you were writing, was her thoughts, right? And like she can actually talk to a dog. I know that in science fiction, there's a lot of talk about don't do info dumps, which is just where you just explain how faster than light travel works or whatever for like 6 pages. And the truth is, there's a lot of science fiction readers love that stuff. Like, they love it. And so it's like most rules that people tell you, it's not written in stone. It's not true in every case. You got to do it right. But one of the things that they do if you want to explain how something works and you don't want to do an info dump, is break it and have your characters trying to fix it. Because to try and fix it, they have to explain how it works. They have to explain what they have to do. And then it gives you an excuse to give the information. And that's something that often, we often are in this situation where we're like, how do I get it so that I can actually say something?
Yeah. How do you manipulate the situation to get what you want out of it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually have it, my world building thing, because every science fiction novel has to deal with faster than light travel. And in mine, they travel on the spaceways, which I got from the Jetsons. And and I even wrote in my little explanation, I'm like, the spaceways work at the speed of plot. So however long I need it to take them to get from one place to another, that's how long the spaceway takes. Not going to give you some mathematical formula. It takes the speed of plot.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. You got to take them from point A to point B, and there you go.
Yeah.
Ron, what's coming up next for you after this? You have this book release, it's out, and what's next?
So I'm currently working on, so we're recording this a little before July, but I'm working on Orange, which is book 3 in the Space Girls series. The weird thing about my series is that books 1 and book 2 kind of happen in parallel, so you can read them in any order. Book 3 happens after the 2 of them. So that's Orange. I do not write them in spectrum order. I probably should, because I have this dream one day of having all the books up there and being able to put them in spectrum order, but that will not be in book order. But so I'm working on Orange, which is the next one. And it's the one where I wrote a draft, had a major turn in the middle. You mentioned writing beginnings and writing endings. I feel like I'm pretty good at the end. I always call it coming in for a landing. I get over the climax and I'm like easing in, just doing all the feel good stuff you're going to do to get to that final scene. But beginnings are hard. Endings are very hard, especially if you have like sort of an action genre. You feel like you need to drop them in the middle of something where they're not going to keep reading your book, but the beginning of your book doesn't have that. So that's always something I struggle with, and that I'm kind of learning about too in this book. But that's also going to be the first one where I'm going to go from an outline in my next draft. So those are the things that are happening. I will say that the book that came out in February, Capricorn Rising, was a prequel that I wrote. And I wrote it for Wattpad. I don't know if you're familiar with Wattpad. It's kind of like Amazon's now gone Vella, where you're writing an episodic thing. And when I went back to turn it into a novel, that's when I kind of realized the difference between a novel and like a television show. Like a television show, like each piece needs to make sense, and they kind of need to push the big plot forward. But with a novel, the plot's going forward and you can't have a whole bunch of other stuff. So Capricorn Rising was the one where I cut just chapters right and left. If they didn't have what I considered the two main characters in them, or they weren't directly about them, then they all got cut. I did keep them, and some of them will make excellent short stories. I'm thinking about doing a short story collection, in my gratuitous spare time.
Yeah, right. That's what we all have. So much spare time.
Yeah. There's always a book in there.
Yeah, exactly. Ron, thank you so much for being with us today. This has been a great conversation. And thank you for being with us today. See you next time. Bye now.
Thank you for tuning into the Fiction Writers Podcast with Lana McAra, where we share tips, tricks, and ideas for fiction that is #unputdownable. Remember to visit our website at www.fictionwriterspodcast.com and enjoy even more great episodes like this one. Again, while you're here, subscribe to us via your favorite network. We look forward to seeing you next time on the Fiction Writers Podcast.